Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name's George Richards. I'm one of the directors at JRP. Welcome. I hope everyone's coping well with the current lockdown and hopefully enjoying working from home and the flexibility that gives us all. We have 4 presenters today. Myself. My background, just as a brief introduction, is I'm one of the directors at JRP. Have a background in energy, having worked in energy for 35 years now, which you can tell by the hairline. My background, just briefly, I did an HVAC apprenticeship a long time ago, and then had a progressive career in energy, culminating in working for BP for a number of years, which was very interesting time, learned an awful lot before joining JRP 9 years ago now. And JRP, for those of you who don't know us, are one of the UK's leading independent energy and net zero specialists. But if you need any more information on us, then please either visit the website or contact us directly afterwards. Then we have Carol. Carol Sumper is an extremely experienced sustainability specialist, and Carol, I'm pleased to say, joined us as our Director of Sustainability in April. And then we have Owen Hewlett, who's the Chief Technical Officer for the Gold Standard Foundation, and he will perhaps tell you a little bit more about himself at the beginning of his slides. And then last but by no means least, we have our esteemed colleague, Dr. Gavin Milligan. Gavin has a background as a chemist. He is a member of JRP's Net Zero Network and has an awful lot of experience around sustainability, having worked as the director or group director of sustainability for William Jackson Food Group. But again, Gavin will tell you a little bit more about his background when we come to his presentation. So moving on. I'm going to cover the first 5 or 10 minutes just to touch on net zero and what it means to your own organisation and why does it matter. And then Carol, I'll hand over to Carol, who will talk about the 10 rules for a successful strategy before handing over to Owen, who will talk about offsetting and navigating science-based value chain targets. And then handing over to Gavin, who will be talking about establishing success criteria, before back to Carol to talking about really, I guess, what everyone's interested in. That's exactly how you go about creating a net zero action plan and some of the key points in that. At the end, we will be taking as many questions as we can or answering as many questions as we can, but please rest assured, because of the number of participants, what we'll do is we will get back to every single individual who poses a question so at some point after the webinar today. So what does net zero mean for your organisation, and indeed, why does it matter? In engaging in conversation with organisations from across the spectre, of all shapes and sizes in all sectors, it's interesting when we ask the question what net zero means to them, and we get different answers. And I think that's down to a lack of understanding, and because of the word carbon is often used. Carbon is obviously not always what we're talking about, and it's carbon equivalence that's often referenced. So you will have, well, for instance, some of the organisations I've spoken to of late, one of which has declared a climate emergency last summer, quickly followed by a very ambitious net zero target. Now, what they meant by that was the same definition as the UK government, that's net greenhouse gases. They had a very ambitious target, but they engaged us to say, right, okay, so we've declared this aspiration and we've declared our very ambitious target, but we don't really know quite how we're going to get there. Other organisations have approached us and said, well, yes, we want to reduce our carbon, but is that scopes 1 and 2, or is it scopes 1, 2 and 3? So there's a little bit of confusion around it. So just for point of clarity for us, what net zero actually means is it's the Climate Change Committee for Climate Change's definition, which is net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. It's a legally binding target that the government set last year, and therefore that's the one that, as far as we're concerned, is the one that we all need to be working towards. Why does it matter? And how has this all come about? This is a bit of an apocalyptic slide, so I don't want to depress anybody, but we've all begun to see the impacts of the climate change that we've already unfortunately seen, from flooding here in the UK to the wildfires in Australia. Absolutely shocking scenes, and more lately, of course, more recently, the plagues of locusts have made their way through Eastern Africa, up through the Middle East, and now into parts of India, hitherto where they've never been seen before. These are all resultant from the impacts of climate change. And of course, the public consciousness has been woken, if you like, by the likes of Greta Thunberg and organisations such as Extinction Rebellion, who really have started to make the right noises and raise people's awareness of the issues and the science that supports it. Well, and what does it mean to individual consumers? We all have choices as individual consumers in terms of what we buy, how we buy it, who we buy it from, when we buy it, how much we buy, etc. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown has probably helped a lot of us to reevaluate some of those buying habits. From a personal perspective, I took the decision a couple of years ago to really focus on and challenge myself every time I went into a shop or went to click to buy something online, to really challenge myself as to why I was doing it and whether I should be doing it in the first place. It seems that you know, if you walk in down your local high street on a Saturday or a Sunday, it's rampant consumerism almost seems to become the social activity for families. Buying things that we don't need with money we probably don't have is not a really sustainable activity. And I think more and more people have really started to challenge themselves, even in terms of how they travel. Most cars have stayed on their drive. My car has stayed on my drive for 11 weeks. I filled it up, I think 3 months ago, and only the other day had to put some more fuel in it. But it's really woken people up to alternatives and challenging their norms. But Gavin will touch on the consumer and the consumer perceptions a little bit later. And last but not least, and certainly from a business perspective, is Mark Carney, I think, made a very powerful statement in November to the BBC when he said firms ignoring the climate crisis will go bust in 10 years. Now that's, you know, quite a scary statement, but those sorts of conversations have been going on for the last 2 or 3 years. And certainly when I attended a number of conferences, when statements were being made by financiers saying that they were no longer prepared to invest in non-sustainable businesses, then the writing was on the wall, and boardrooms started to sit up and take notice and take this issue seriously. And increasingly, I would say in the last 6 to 12 months, those conversations have really ramped up. So we're now currently working with a number of organisations from different sectors, helping them to develop their own net zero strategy, which will be different for every organisation, granted. So I'll hand over now to my colleague, Carol.
Thanks, George. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go through the basic rules for good practice emissions accounting to end up with a really good reduction strategy. I'm conscious that there are a lot of different organisations listening in today, and you may be at various stages of that journey, but hopefully there'll be something for everyone to pick up on. It's worth having in the back of your mind the 5 accounting principles set by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol of relevance, completeness, consistency, very importantly, transparency and accuracy. So if you look at the graphic on the left, this is coming straight out of the GHG Protocol's Corporate Standard Reporting Guide. And if you haven't seen that, if you don't have a copy, I would advise you to download it, because it's full of great advice and really good case studies. And they're identifying for a hypothetical company, the parent set up, the companies within the group as the organisational boundary, the legal entity, and then identifying where assets are owned and controlled directly or they're leased as the operational boundary, and identifying that from those activities there will be direct on-site and indirect off-site emissions involved. If you look on the right-hand side, this is a really good illustration, a very simple graphic from Amazon, and it's well worth going on to that link as well and having a look at how Amazon are describing their organisational and operational footprint. And they're starting on the left at the top with their factory, which is interesting because when you start to put your inventory together, it's basically a catalogue of all of the sources of emissions arising from the things that you do as part of your core missions. So if we go on to rule number 3, it's very important to identify those emissions in terms of scopes. Again, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol identifies what each scope is in detail, but scope 1 and scope 2 are basically those emissions that you have direct control over within your operational boundary. And scope 3 emissions are pretty much everything else. It's the upstream emissions from all of the goods and services and components that you're buying in to do what you do, and also looking at downstream emissions of when things go out your door and go off into the marketplace. And I've used the graphic from McGill University in Canada's way of identifying this, because there are a lot of university reps listening in this morning. And this is a really, really good, impactful way of instantly identifying how all of their operations fit into those different scopes. And because they have their own land estate, their agricultural management research programs, they also have carbon sinks. So they've added these into the mix as well to show how the greenhouse gases cycle works. I just want to say something about materiality. That comes back to the accuracy core principle. If there are discrepancies in the data as you're reporting that are greater than 5%, they could affect the accuracy of your annual reporting. So do take care when you're mapping out your inventory. And reporting it, it's always worthwhile trying to align your greenhouse gas reporting year with your financial reporting year. It just makes things an awful lot simpler because you're just working to one reporting process. So if we come on to rule 5, this is about looking at scope 3 in more detail and engaging with your suppliers and explaining why that's really important. The Carbon Disclosure Project advised that if 2/3 or more of your annual spend as part of your operations, or 2/3 or more of your scope 3 emissions from raw materials through to going out the door, you really need to talk to your suppliers about what they're doing to set good targets for their scopes 1 and 2 emissions, and also encourage your suppliers to think about their own scope 3 emissions. We'll come on to science-based targets shortly, but if you look at the graphic on the left-hand side, Subaru, obviously a big manufacturer making vehicles, so they've mapped out all of their emissions, their scope 1 and 2 emissions are really small compared to their scope 3 emissions. Now, they've accounted for what they're buying in to make their product. They've also looked downstream to emissions from in use of those vehicles, and also at the end of life. And whilst they don't necessarily have to account for them in a financial sense, it's important that they're aware of those impacts, because it helps them to feed that back into their design process to make sure that they're being as resource efficient as possible. And that again helps to greatly reduce emissions to get to net zero. You can go onto the link there as well when you have the slide set to look at that in more detail. So coming on to rule number 6. Oh, sorry. This is just another example of why it's important to map your scope 3 emissions out. And Bunge is a big American multinational. They're providing ingredients and products to some of the world's biggest brands. And up in the right-hand corner, you've got the brands that are operational in Europe. They've looked at upstream and downstream. Their upstream emissions from purchased goods and services are almost half of their scope 3. But they've also identified, as with Subaru, their end of life treatment of sold products. So again, they're taking that into account, and that will cover things like the packaging they use as well. So it's really important to get a full picture of the impact that you're having on greenhouse gas emissions in the round to get to net zero. So that now if we come on to rule number 6. To come back to your operational boundaries and those things under your direct control, scope 1 and scope 2, it's really good to have an energy management system set up. And this is important so that you can identify the biggest opportunities you have for reducing emissions on site and where the biggest challenges are. And it's important to put energy efficiency as absolute priority, because most organisations can save from around 10% up to 30% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions by taking that into account. And it often involves some kind of behaviour change or culture change programme so that everybody understands their role in playing their part. And targets really do need to be science-based. Up until now, a few years ago, a lot of organisations would say, well, okay, let's say that we'll reduce our emissions by 10–20% over the next 2 to 5 years. That's not good enough anymore. There is so much science out there about climate change and each sector's contribution towards those impacts, that it's important that you know within your sector what your trajectory should be. So it's very simple. You can go onto the Science Based Targets website and use their calculator by feeding in your emissions data and then working out what your trajectory should be. But before you do that, don't set that target without having first established where you are now, get a meaningful baseline and identify where you can start to make the biggest reductions. Because then when you plug your data into the science-based target, you know exactly what time frame you're looking for. You can set yourself interim targets to 2050. And the Science Based Targets website is always reporting on the number of companies who are taking action. And Owen's going to be speaking to you about that in more detail. So coming on to number 8, when you get to the end of your reporting year, you're almost certainly going to have some residual emissions around that you haven't been able to do anything about. Obviously, the ultimate goal for everyone is to get to absolute zero, but that's not going to be possible without further technological change, further changes in the marketplace, or changes by consumers. So whilst offsetting has been given a bad press, if you do it properly, you do it with transparency and you do it with accuracy, you can make a big positive impact. You could think about investing in the area where you're based. For example, you could use the cost of offsetting into helping a community facility like a local school to invest in a renewable energy systems, replacing old oil and gas boilers, or going to a green electricity setup. Or that you could do it overseas. You could look to see where some of your main supplies are coming from and what the climate issues there are, and how you could help to resolve some of those things, possibly by providing clean water. And then if you wanted to invest in a vulnerable ecosystem, because that's part of what you're interested in as a business, it's core to your brand. The World Land Trust is a great organisation. One of the patrons is Sir David Attenborough, and you can find out more about doing that on their website. Or if you want to do something back in the UK, I can recommend the Small Woods Association to you. They're setting up their own woodland carbon sink scheme for offsetting, and they're working with DEFRA on that, so you can get further advice from them direct. So coming on to number 9. When you've got your action plan together and it's fully underpinned by your science-based target, it's really important that that action plan is being driven from the top of the organisation right down through, and also that there's feedback coming from the bottom up, because that makes for a successful outcome. And I've used this example, it's the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm sure that you're hearing a lot about them at the moment, because they have leading specialists talking about the current pandemic and the epidemiology of it. They asked us to work with them last year to set a new energy and carbon management plan in place that's looking at scopes 1, 2 and 3. So as part of that, they've set up a Sustainability Action Committee involving members of the faculties, bringing their own personal interests and skills into each of those subgroups. Each of those subgroups has a business plan linked to the science-based target and trajectory that they're using. They haven't committed to a formal science-based target yet, because they want to spend the next few years getting their reporting systems properly set up, getting that engagement with suppliers, and then when they're ready, they'll commit to the science-based target. Because once you commit formally, you get externally evaluated on an annual basis. So it's serious, but well worthwhile. And they also have a communication and engagement strategy, because the impetus for this came from the student body. So they're demonstrating to the student body that what they care about really is happening now. And coming on to number 10, don't struggle and go around in circles. Get help when you need it, and from the most suitable organisation. And there's masses of free advice and guidance out there from all sorts of different types of organisation. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an obvious one. The Carbon Disclosure Project is really good. You don't have to be a member to get access to their information and reports. You just need to register. The GESI, the General Enabling for Sustainability Initiative, is focusing particularly on the ICT sector. And that's really important, particularly when you're looking at the supply chain side and where a lot of the raw materials are coming from. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Circular Ecology are all about designing out waste, being really resource efficient and bringing emissions down that way. And then last but not least, there's the EAUC for the higher education sector, and the government website with all sorts of really good information on conversion factors and how to use them for organisational reporting. So I'll hand back to you now, George.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was insightful as always. Now I'm going to hand over to Owen to talk about navigating science-based value chain targets and carbon offsetting. Over to you, Owen.
Yeah, thanks, George, and hi everybody. Thanks JRP and all of you for lending me the kind of platform and your ears for what I'll share. If you go on a couple of slides there, George, I'll get into it. So maybe just to introduce myself and my organization, my personal interest and expertise, if you like, is in making sure that the policy mechanisms, incentives, and actions towards averting the climate emergency have integrity and they work holistically together. You could kind of summarize that by saying we have a huge problem to solve. It's really important that all of the levers for change are available to all of the actors, and that those levers of change are good and don't trip each other up, don't contradict each other. My voice to supplement that is from a civil society background. So I'm not from business, I'm not from government, I'm independent, and we are independent of both of those things. And really, we are here to communicate what is credible in the theory of change towards resolving the climate emergency. And I think that's very well aligned with what you've already heard from George and Carol. Maybe just to introduce the organization. So Gold Standard is a Swiss non-profit. We were founded maybe 17 years ago now by WWF. And WWF themselves, by the way, are one of the key voices in civil society in all of this. So if you think of WWF as an advocate and a lobbyist and a thought leader, think of us as demonstrating that in practitioner terms, like what is the art of the possible on the ground in real terms. We are a standards and certification organization at one level. So think of us like a fair trade or an FSC. We certify climate mitigation actions, so projects or interventions or financial facilities or companies towards their environmental targets. And at the other level, we're a thought leader and a policy advocate and an innovator in that space. My personal background's a bit odd. I come from construction and property development originally, based down here in Bristol, so nice to engage on a UK platform. Most of my work is in international climate policy and finance. You probably know us best in the world of carbon credits. If you know us at all, you'll often see the kind of higher caliber buyers or sellers of carbon credits refer to Gold Standard. But if you go on a slide, George, we actually do a little more than that these days. I would characterize it in three key pillars of action, which would be environmental markets, which is carbon, corporate sustainability, which is more your SBTI, and I'll talk more about that today. And then I'm also interested in climate and development finance, which is more at the governmental country level. But I think where things really get interesting is the nexus of those three pillars. So although those three things can work and should work in isolation and on their own merits, it's also really important that they work together, because then we really start to optimize. If you go on a slide there, George. So like I say, what I'm really interested in is in integrity. And by integrity, I think you can break that down into four key things. One is the integrity of the action. So what mitigation action you're taking, do it well and do it right. If you're going to plant trees, make sure you look after the land. The second is the quantification and the monitoring. If you're going to do that, make sure you quantify the results properly. I think Carol alluded to that really nicely. The third would be that the way you are packaging that up as a mechanism works. If you're going to have a carbon credit, that carbon credit should be functionally credible and have integrity. And then lastly, it should be integrated well within your claims and your strategy. So if you're going to use carbon credits at all, do it right, as Carol said. And then just one quick message from this slide, I suppose, is that we're talking heavily about net zero climate targets today, but it's worth keeping in mind that that is holistically integrated with the Sustainable Development Goals, and the two are not mutually exclusive, and they optimize each other. If you think about sustainable development and climate together, you get a better result in both and you mitigate your overall risk. Or maybe put another way, it's not credible to claim you're doing good in one thing while doing rampant harm to, say, water or biodiversity. So if you go on a slide there, George, I'll get into where civil society, big civil society is at with this problem. We often kind of talk about the policy era that we're in. So we were in the Kyoto era, we're now in the Paris era, but I'd actually rearrange that a little bit and say this is the science-based era. The science, the clarity of the science, the IPCC special report of a couple of years ago is a gift, because it tells us explicitly and clearly and transparently where we are, where we need to get to, and if we don't get there, what will happen. And, you know, it's analogous, like if you changed jobs and had to take a pay cut, but it was a job you really wanted, you wouldn't just guess what budget changes you need to make, right? You'd know your current salary, you'd know your new salary, you'd know that you'd lose your mortgage if you didn't keep that up, and you'd look at ways to adjust. And it's really the same in global warming terms. We know we are 1.1-ish above pre-industrial levels. We know that is essential to keep below 1.5, and we know what the budgets are to get there. If we go above 1.5, and this is a theme I'll come back to in a fairly severe way in a minute, the consequences do not bear thinking about. This is not a things might get a little bit warmer in the British summertime. You know, as Mark Carney said, your business will go bust, so will all of them, and society will start to break down. This is not a kind of hypothetical problem anymore. And I think it's worth noting that the current country commitments under the Paris Agreement are something like 3.3 degrees. So double where we need to be. If you go on a slide there, I promise I'll get a bit more cheerful as we go through this. So George already covered this a little bit at the start. What does global net zero mean? Extracted from IPCC, which is the Independent Scientific Committee. It basically means we have to get our emissions in line with a 1.5 degree target, and then we must balance that with carbon removals, so sinks like woody biomass or soil or oceans or technology-based removals to balance the net zero by latest 2050. Earlier would be better. And then it progresses on to full decarbonisation by the end of the century. So there's really two parts to the equation: get your emissions down, balance them with sinks. One subtle nuance here is that the report also said that we must lock in that 1.5 degree emissions part by 2030. Beyond 2030, it's too late. Like we won't be able to claw it back. And then we're into what's the least worst we can make this problem. We still genuinely have a chance of keeping this below 1.5 and the effects not being catastrophic. So sort of ramping up my optimism a little bit. If you go on a slide there, please, George. It's kind of interesting, I think, when you get into the reducing emissions and increasing sequestration and thinking about like whose problem are each of those things, who's accountable for each of those things. Now, science-based targets, which I'll talk about a little bit more, places the accountability for emissions with all of us. Sequestration's difficult. It's difficult for an individual company to deal with carbon sinks at a global basis. You know, you don't own the oceans, you don't own vast areas of forests. Some of your industries have no carbon removal potential. So this is where thinking about how the mechanisms should work together is really important. If we go on a slide there, please, George. So this is like, if this slide, I suppose, or the message around this slide, if you take nothing else away from what I'm sharing, this is the one. We all need to take accountability for our emissions in line with science. And when I say we, I mean that as all of you as individuals. Go to WWF's website. There's a calculator that'll tell you where you are now and how to reduce it to get in line with science. It means all of us as organizations, mine and yours, and it means the UK, all of the countries and all of the world. There's no part of this system that is excluded from getting below 1.5 degrees. That is probably the number one thing to take away from all of this. So a severe statement here, if you like. If your organization doesn't get itself on a pathway to 1.5 degree conformity, then your organization is doing harm to the planet. Or maybe put another way, maybe reverse engineer that severe statement before I come on to one more optimistically. For planetary boundaries, for this climate emergency, it would be better if your organization didn't exist if you don't get in line with science. Now, that's quite a hard pill to swallow. Now, the more optimistic statement to that is, it is possible, and to reassure everybody, because that's quite a kind of severe position to take, you don't necessarily need to come out and say, I know exactly how I'm going to do that. I fully understand it. I comprehend it. And this is my action plan. As Carol said, there's 10 steps that she came up with, which I think are very practicable. It's perfectly fine to go, wow, we acknowledge this problem. We know we need to get our act together and understand it and put a plan in place. We don't yet know what that's going to be, but we're committed to figuring it out. That is a perfectly reasonable position to take as an organization. What is not a reasonable position to take is, shrugging your shoulders and saying, you know, well, I'm not regulated to do it. If nobody else is doing it, then I won't bother. You can have that argument when society breaks down, if you like, and your business is gone. I would really, really strongly recommend everybody gets themselves on a science-based journey. If we go on a slide there, please, George. So the last slide really was talking about the kind of reason for sharing a picture of a neighborhood there was just to say that if we all clean up our backyards, then the neighborhood gets clean. If some of us clean up our backyards, but some of us don't, and we pay somebody else to clean up their backyard, then the neighborhood won't overall be clean. That's kind of analogous to what the Science-Based Targets Initiative is trying to do. It's really saying that if we all, as organizations, and ideally individuals, get our own boundary in line with 1.5 degree science, then the climate emergency will be averted. If, as Carol pointed out, I don't do that and I just offset and I kind of like shrug my shoulders and say, well, you know, regulation either will or won't get there for us, then the impact of that doesn't bear thinking about, to be quite honest. So I think it's really important that everybody, like the Paris Agreement for companies, the sun around which all of these other mechanisms and actions revolve, is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's not simple, there is complexity in there, but I would say that most professionals in business, if with a little time on your side, will be able to get your heads around that and understand it. But even more important right now is to commit to the understanding that it's a non-negotiable, regardless of what regulation is saying. Like I say, regulation, lawyers, they can argue it out when the world is on fire. It's going to be too late by then. So if we go on a slide there, George, I'll just get into a couple of other things. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative has a net zero dialogue, of which I'm part. So Science-Based Targets started life, it launched in Paris in 2015, along with the Paris Agreement. And really what it was saying is this is a method for figuring out where you are now and where you need to get to for the 1.5 degree trajectory. Very, very helpful. That is I've changed my job, this is my old salary, this is my new salary, and this is how I'm going to adjust my lifestyle. That is the core thing that everybody needs to get their heads around. But since then, since the IPCC, they've also been working on how companies can work on net zero. Actually, as these things are inevitably dynamic, there's some new definitions coming out this month, which will explain how mechanisms can support that core trajectory and go beyond to neutralize emissions with sinks or to compensate emissions with offsetting. So as Carol said, you know, offsetting can be the lowest common denominator. If you do it instead of science-based targets, you are making things worse, not better, but you're kind of, you know, greenwashing effectively. It's the classic definition of greenwashing. If you do compensation of residual emissions while on a science-based journey, that starts to look and smell like leadership to me. That's saying you're earning the right to offset your residual emissions and shifts it to the highest common denominator. So we go on a slide there, please, George. There's a lot of questions to answer in that. There's a lot of flux around the carbon market and carbon credits. What can you use them for? What needs to change to align with the Paris Agreement? As I said earlier, you know, we're working hard in markets to make sure these things integrate with other policies. There's a difference between activities that reduce emissions and those that remove emissions, and how those should be reported in your scope 3, how we should think about them from a offsetting perspective. We also need to get practical, right? You know, these actions, you know, 2030 is the deadline to lock these things in. It's important to account accurately and be able to transparently show we got there. The last thing we need is to get to 2050 and figure out that we got the maths wrong and actually we're already at 1.8 or something. But equally, that needs to get a lot simpler. Like we don't have time to be fiddling around with the minutiae anymore. It's too late for that. So lots of questions coming out around how science-based targets, how Paris Agreement, how carbon markets align around that IPCC definition. But I would say that is a how, not a what question or an if question. We are going to align around the science more and more, and you know this is a how question for us to answer. If we go on a slide there, George, coming to the end. Just a quick note really on the future of offsetting, like I say, aligning with the Paris Agreement and dealing with the inherent double claiming between carbon markets and the Paris Agreement and carbon markets and your scope 3. That's kind of, you know, I spend probably a day a week on that topic right now. I'm really committed to the top one there, which is going beyond. Offsetting carbon markets are not a mechanism to do instead of your science-based targets. They're a mechanism to do as well as your science-based targets. I would say I think it's perfectly reasonable, as I said earlier, to be figuring out how you're going to do this and to be offsetting during that period. So you might go, wow, I really take away from this. I need to get in line with science. It's going to take me 6 months to figure all of that out and what I'm going to do about it. That's perfectly reasonable. Do offset in the meantime. And I would say as individuals, actually, just a side note there, the WWF footprinting tool will tell you what to do to get in line with science yourselves. There is a point where you're kind of vanishing return. So, getting in line with, the equivalent of 0.9 versus 0.8 planet Earths, that will take a huge amount of effort, and it may be more beneficial to start offsetting, but start offsetting when you're in line with science, not instead of. Lots of new options, lots of new activities, lots of new exciting claims, alignment with the SDGs, lots of focus on nature-based solutions, technology-based removals, carbon markets. Think of them, carbon offsetting, as the scalpel, if you like, that is the leading edge of mitigation action. It's the thing that should target the highest hanging fruit, as opposed to the business as usual stuff. And then credibility. For the first time in my career, I really feel like civil society has recognized the need to stop siloed thinking between markets and Paris and offsetting and science-based targets, and make sure those things work holistically. I bang that drum probably for another day a week, trying to get everybody aligned around that. And that's I think you'll see in the next 2 years, a kind of credible framework that builds off the foundation of science-based target and makes sense of the mechanisms around it. Slide there, please, George. I think I'm coming to the end. Just wanted to flag another program which sort of echoes what Carol was saying. We have on our website a program we run called Value Change, which is a place where we gather best practice, write guidance, have corporate working groups, pilot certification projects that are looking at action within Scope 3. So some of that is highly technical, some of it is more entry level, but I would urge you to take a look at that. If you go on a slide there, George, I wanted to flag one document, which is one that we wrote with the Science Based Targets partners and Navigant last year, which is how to think about actions in Scope 3. So one of the key questions I'm sure people will ask is, so what actions should I take? Which are the best actions to take in my supply chain? This document sets out some of the archetypal actions, preferred procurement, direct action, price premiums, all of those kind of things are in there in a non-technical summary way. Obviously, you need to interpret those things for yourself in your sector and business, but it's a good jumping off point. I would also say if you go to the Science Based Targets website, they have sectoral guides. And even if they're not for your sector, I was reading the apparel sector guide from Science Based Targets the other day. And I think there's inspiration and ideas to be drawn from other sectors. So just because your sector may not be on there, don't let that stop you reading what the textile industry is doing or what the construction industry is doing, because these archetypal ideas in this document start to play out in real terms, real examples in other sectors, and can be an inspiration for your work. So one more slide, I think, George. Yeah, if you want to see a case study, we work with Mars. Mars is one of the most, well, I would say actually the most committed company in the agriculture sector to science-based targets and credibility. They're still family owned somehow after all this time. There's a Mars family, literally. And they figured that their supply chain emissions were equivalent to the country of Panama. And the family, I think, whatever motivates you, I guess, probably realized that legacy is attached to their name. And Mars is now hugely committed to driving down their emissions in line with science. They publish, unusually for an organization that makes M&Ms or something, they publish thought leadership on what is credible and what isn't. This is just a case study of what they're doing in their wheat supply chain in Australia. So if you want to see how a credible company is acting, then interesting to go and see what they're doing in that particular context. And I think, George, that's it from my side. Obviously around for questions later. And oh yeah, so there's my email address. Feel free to get in touch. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Owen. That was really interesting, and supports obviously some of the key messages. But we'll summarise right at the end each of the presentations, taking some of the key points. But now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Gavin Milligan.
Thank you, George. Hopefully you can hear me. Hello, George.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, if you could just step on to the next slide, please. And Thank you, everybody, for turning up to listen to us speak today, and thanks to JRP for the invitation. And when I talk about success criteria, I'm going to talk primarily from the perspective of stakeholders. I will slip into market speak occasionally, but I know that there are quite a few public sector organizations represented today on the call. So if I do talk about consumers inadvertently, then stakeholders is really the word that I'm trying to get to. But in this particular slide, this was a consumer poll. And this feeds back into some of the things that Owen has been saying. If people are asked, if consumers are asked what they think about the net zero target, well, the first thing is there is a surprising degree of engagement and understanding. This is a survey which is less than a year old. We'll come on to how the COVID outbreak has impacted consumer views in a number of areas. But this is a fairly straightforward question: 2050 net zero. Should it be brought forward? Should it be there at all? And then you've got a figure around 80% of consumers, 2050 or earlier. And now in this context, of course, we're talking to ordinary citizens who don't necessarily appreciate quite what is involved in achieving net zero, or even necessarily what it means. They have a general sense. And I was involved in doing some consumer research a few months ago before the COVID outbreak. And it's still the case that a large number of citizens get their environmental intelligence, as it were, from television as a channel. So people watching Blue Planet series and the like. So in this particular case, there is a broad understanding about what net zero might mean, but not necessarily what's involved in delivering it. I'm not going to reference the SDGs endlessly through the course of these slides, but there's a clear link to 13 on this one. And George, if you step on, please, to the next slide. Another piece of consumer work, this one again, similar sort of age, perhaps a little bit older. Consumers are asked about brand loyalty and the environmental credentials of brands. Now, the first problem with this, unlike the last question, is that the term environmentally friendly is clearly very loose, and it's not necessarily clear that all of those consumers have the same interpretation of the term. And equally, any of you who operate in commercial environments will know that the words that people use when they're asked about their environmental intentions versus their actions, sometimes there's quite a big gap, and price is still a major determinant in how people shop. So the way to interpret this statement is more that all other things being equal, if the product or a brand that I can see isn't as environmentally friendly as another option, by my definition of environmentally friendly, I may well choose the one which is more environmentally friendly. So it's not quite as cut and dried as that statement makes it appear. Nevertheless, it's an indicator of how consumers are likely to behave. And that's not just about consumers in stores. This is also about all of us as citizens in our daily lives and the choices that we make. And we'll come on to that in the next couple of slides. But just finally here, sorry, George, I misled you there slightly. Just as a final point on this slide, all of us who are in supply chains at points or value chains at points before end users do have an opportunity to manage some of this through choice editing in the ranges that we make available. We've seen a number of UK grocery chains do that in the social space with Fairtrade, for instance. So now, George, you can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So another piece of research here, again, from about a year ago in this particular case, where consumers, in this case, again, this is a consumer focus, will make their decisions based on characteristics of not just the product itself, but its packaging and its manufacture. So the set of images on the left-hand side refers to market growth of products. This is in North America. Market growth of products which make particular claims about resource management in their manufacturing, or certainly upstream of the consumer. And you can see there that renewable energy scored pretty highly in terms of value. Carbon footprint scored fairly highly in terms of growth, in terms of claims made, but a claim made less frequently, partly because, going back to some of what Owen was saying, it's a much easier and more auditable claim to make to say you're using renewable energy than it is to make something sensible about a life cycle assessment conducting the carbon footprint of a product or a process or a category. And in terms of packaging, there's a kind of a social message in here that consumers resonate with things that they can understand and in which they can take part. So if you give somebody an item packaged in something which they can recycle, and they can then manage that recycling in their kitchen, then they feel like they've been part of the solution. Arguably, it's better to have less packaging, and there are some categories in the UK, certainly things like Easter eggs, where you've seen that happen, certainly at the lower end of the market, seen that happen over the last few years. But if you present the consumer with the less packaging or the sustainable packaging option, they are less engaged with the process, and so there's a bit less resonance, at least so far. And some of that's about communication rather than anything more fundamental. And again, although I said I wouldn't talk about the SDGs, SDG 12 is a clear link into this on the right-hand side. Okay, George, thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about customers here, and here's some examples. And I noticed actually one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A relates to what the panel are doing personally to reduce our own emissions, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a bit more detail in the Q&A at the end. But here are some examples, again, of a relatively recent survey asking people what they would do as part of a contribution towards a lower carbon future. And there are some clear links. We've heard George tell us how he's not been driving his car. Obviously, it's true for most of us for all sorts of reasons, which are rather disruptive over the last few months. But people talking about being prepared to consume less in the way of fuels, consume less in the way of disposable apparel, eat less in the way of energy intensive or emissions intensive red meat. And I realize that there's certainly been some pushback from the red meat sector against some of the things that have been said about the emissions from red meat products. But of course, there are limits. Actually, a surprising number of people, even so, prepared to become vegetarian and vegan. But I've highlighted the key respondent numbers, and the no to becoming vegan is pretty much in line with the yeses to many of those other behavioral questions. And it's interesting to see that there's already some kind of response coming from the public sector. Any of you on the call from local government may well be involved in discussions around repurposing parts of urban environments to have more cycle and walking routes, and maybe giving less priority to motorized vehicles. Okay, moving on again then, please, George. However, and this is going back very much to the point that Owen raised, you can make some factually accurate statements, and unfortunately, my attempt to blank out the identity of the airline in question has failed with the reformatting of the slide. But there we are. So let's take it on face value that at Stansted Airport, those hand dryers in the gents' toilet there genuinely are 80% less energy intensive than hand dryers or towels. And let's take it at face value that at Toulouse Airport, at the other end of the flight, all those electric vehicles are making some kind of impact, particularly in France, which has quite a high nuclear fleet and a fair amount of hydro in its mix as well. Now, clearly, nuclear at least comes with all sorts of other issues which might not be short-term carbon related. So you've got claims being made at airports at either end of a flight about low carbon intensity facilities, and in between, you've got the flight. And that particular airline recently got into a bit of a tangle with the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK about claims it made around its environmental performance. Now, clearly, Stansted Airport is making a factual statement. Toulouse Airport are making a factual statement. But airports without aeroplanes are pretty pointless, and airplanes without airports are pretty pointless. So you have to take a systemic view of what's going on rather than simply talk about your little piece. And again, that kind of links to one of the Q&A questions about system-wide issues, as opposed to simply enterprise issues. And then the lower image there, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in Texas, making a claim it's the first carbon neutral airport in the Americas. Let's take that at face value, probably achieved by offsetting. Despite the oil industry, there's an awful lot of wind energy in Texas. It's a big place and some of it's quite flat. But again, they have the same problem, and it amuses me slightly that in the image they've chosen to use there, it's almost as though that person is pointing at the airplane and saying, well, that's not carbon neutral. So make sure you take a systemic view, and consistent performance is really quite key in all of this. If you end up undermining your message with some slightly questionable claims, then you'll potentially more than undo any good that you have done. Next slide, please, George. To which point, here are some stats from CDP on the left-hand side, talking about the supply chain emissions, so scope 3 to scope 1 and 2 ratio. Some of you may be familiar with this, but with the exception of a couple down the bottom, particularly the fossil fuel sector itself, in all cases, typically the, on average, I should say, across all respondents to CDP, the scope 3 emissions are a factor of 5.5 to 1 larger than scope 1 and scope 2. So again, back to the point raised by the questioner, it's all well and good talking about what you're doing within your own metaphorical four walls, but if what you do within your own four walls requires upstream and downstream activities which are carbon intensive or emissions intensive, then you have to take that into account in exactly the same way as airports and airlines. And you might sometimes be surprised as to where those hotspots arise. There's an example there on the bottom right, some work that was conducted, or the authors' names have gone a bit adrift. The names on the bottom left actually relate to the pie chart, not to the CDP bar chart. And that's the emissions are associated with the global warming potential of a loaf of bread. And you can see that the ammonium nitrate fertilizer is significantly the biggest component, and it is larger than the energy consumed in baking. So you may sometimes get some surprises where you look along your value chains. If you were to toast that bread in your own kitchen, then that profile would change quite radically. But this is as it were, the sliced loaf as bought in retail outlets. So when you look at the value chain and you look at the system collectively, you need to make sure that you address the genuine hotspots rather than the things that may just look like they are going to be the targets. Doesn't mean you shouldn't also address those. But if you have a limited amount of resource to address some of these challenges, then you should try and go for the big issues. Of course, that is making an assumption that you have the capacity to influence and actually move the dial independently. Next slide, please, George. So here is some much more recent research which was published during the pandemic. I guess the most important takeaway from this is the two pie charts in the middle of that slide, where people were asked, has your experience as a consequence of what's gone on made you think that you're going to change what you do in future? In the middle, people said, we've already moved over the last year. Even some of those who've said they don't really consider environmental issues to be significant. And then when you look at the columns on the right, people are saying, actually, the experience of the last few months, and we all have seen the hashtag Build Back Better, the experience of the last few months has made them think even more about change. And the figure for the UK was, I think, around 80% of people have said they want to see at least some aspects of daily life change. And that's been driven by their experiences during the lockdown. I'm sure many of you, like me, who don't live in urban environments, will have looked up at the sky over the last few months before flights resumed at some kind of frequency, been amazed how blue the sky can be without vapor trails being wafted all over at high altitudes. Next slide, please, George. I know I'm running out of time. So finally, what's changing? Well, the pandemic, as we saw directly on the previous slide, has driven some change in consumer sentiment. And that'll be reflected in all stakeholder groups where market value is an issue. Regulation is going to come to reflect some of that, and you've seen some statements coming out from the UK government over the course of the last few months about prioritising non-fossil fuel traffic types. Then business, because of the risk associated with failure to supply customers or loss of customer channels, you'll see moves towards reshoring, you'll see supply chain shortening. Disintermediation is a wonderful term for that. You'll see a greater focus on transparency and disclosure from businesses, because they want to know where their risk really sits. And clearly, once the cat is out of the bag, then that disclosure is available more broadly. An increase in home working, which I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have been doing over the last couple of months, moves some of our businesses' emissions. Now, the HSE at the beginning of the lockdown period said there's a derogation on DSE, display screen equipment, assessments in the home. But there are many things that all of us will have to do if we do work from home, which will change our emissions profile, our work-related personal emissions profile. And work has been published historically, which suggests that many people, when they work from home during the winter, will have the central heating on all day for the whole house, which means that instead of their employer heating a few square meters for them, they're heating an entire house for their work day, which potentially means that the emissions profile per individual goes up, but that's distanced from the employer's own energy bills. And then finally, when it's about resilience, and so companies will be looking for changes in function and performance and capacity and capability, which means organizations, if you want to look at your tier 1 and you expect an improvement in your value chain's performance, you cannot see tier 2 realistically. So you'll be relying on your tier 1 suppliers to look at their tier 1 suppliers, and so on. And so on to the final slide, please, George. Some of this is about taking a stand and being seen and heard, and that does again reflects back on some of what Owen was talking about. There's an example here from the food sector. Guy is the CEO of Riverford Organics, which runs home delivery organic vegetable and other box scheme, making the obvious statement there about plastic. There's nothing inherently wrong with plastic, it's where it ends up is the problem, saying that actually it's a distraction. The issue is climate change, and he is being, I mean, you can read the words for yourselves, potentially quite critical, you might think, of his customers, although people who've chosen to eat organic in the first place and those who choose to opt out of high street grocery are probably a particular type of consumer who will be more receptive to that message anyway. But Guy has stood up, said that publicly, and that another response there to surveys, and again, it's about a year old, that one. The majority of the UK public expect CEOs to lead the charge. This is not just about letting governments do it. And when you think back to some of those earlier stats that I showed you about the UK consumer being happy that the net zero target is brought forward from 2050, not really knowing what that means, but expecting that the providers of the goods and services that they use will do it for them, because those are the people who they believe have the capacity to move the dial. And that brings me to the end of my section. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Always extremely interested to hear what you have to say. Gavin will be remaining to help answer a few questions at the end, time allowing, of course. So back to Carol, talk about the creation of net zero action plans. Over to you, Carol.
Thanks, George, and hello again, everybody. If we move on to the next slide, I just want to remind everybody again about those 5 core accounting principles of relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. And I think that why those are so important has been amplified by Owen's presentation and just now by Gavin. So taking up where Gavin left off, that people are expecting CEOs and MDs of businesses to show leadership. It's surprisingly quite common that senior teams are not greenhouse gas accounting literate at present. It's quite unusual to find a CEO who fully understands all of those issues and the opportunities for the business. So in getting real leadership, it's important to get all of the decision makers at the senior level to get to grips with the upstream and downstream impacts of the organisation and identify those risks and take the opportunity to resolve them and make this process part of the business strategy going forward. So you really do need to start with a baseline understanding of where you are now. And a good way of doing that is to establish what we call a project charter. So you look at your baseline and then you scope out what needs to change. And that's why it's so important to get the top team involved, and some kind of capacity building or training exercise to get everybody on the same page is really important. And then end up with maybe a key director, or maybe even the CEO would be ideal as a sponsor, the internal sponsor for the process. So getting the right personnel involved is absolutely critical. And again, you know, train where training is needed to get everybody up to speed. Identifying who's responsible for what is very important. And whilst Green Champions have definitely got a role in this process, it's important to look at post-holder responsibilities and get the importance of the greenhouse gas accounting process and the action plan written into those post-holder job descriptions and forward job plans. So it's formalised. It then becomes part of the business strategy going forwards, and it's much easier to set measurable time-related objectives for doing that. And the plan, do, report, review, iterative performance improvement process, you may already have that in place if you're an organisation with ISO 9001 or ISO 14001 for environmental management systems, or even ideally ISO 50001 for energy management systems. So to make that process greenhouse gas accounting proof, embed the same process when you're looking at greenhouse gases. And I've listed these items or elements 1 to 15 around that process. Starting with your charter is very important. Take the time to do it well, because it will pay dividends. Review your corporate policies and the processes and procedures for implementing them. Make sure that they are GHG proofed. Training could be an ongoing thing. We've heard so much about the supply chain. If you get procurement right, you can really make life a lot easier. So that's a forensic look at how goods and services are procured, and start to ask questions of those businesses that you're inviting to tender. It's free to ask those questions, and you could be surprised at what you get back. Having the right systems and controls is really important too. And we've heard a lot about understanding the risks and opportunities so that value can be added. And by scoping out the potentials across the whole life cycle of what your organisation does, going back to some of the examples we've already heard about, can pay dividends. I've got a few things here. So Paptic is a Finnish organisation, and they make eco-friendly, biodegradable, recyclable packaging from paper and timber wastes, and they've come up with a process that's now part of their marketing sell, which is really very powerful. Mud Jeans use another concept, which is product of service. So you don't have to buy a pair; you can lease a pair of jeans from Mud. And when you've finished with them or you've worn them out, you send the whole thing back and they get completely remanufactured. So they're looking forensically with their recycling partners about making that really resource efficient, reducing emissions, not just in energy use, but also through the water they use and the recycling process itself. And again, very conscious of the university reps listening today. If you look at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, they're ranked #1 in the world, and they have a set of teaching programs completely aligned with how they operate. So they are looking at sustainability in the round, so they're looking at resource efficiency and carbon emissions reduction in the round. So if you take hold of these things and really look at them in depth across the organisation, there are big wins to be had. So coming on to looking at standards and good practice, we've already heard, next slide, we've already heard about the SDGs. These come as a set. They're not for cherry picking. So 13 is obviously about climate action, but as Owen said, and as Gavin said, they relate to all of the others. You need to look at them in a complete way. And depending on what kind of organisation you are, especially if you're in manufacturing, that circular economy model is definitely worth embracing. Universities and HEIs will be looking to have a really credible carbon management plan that's being implemented fully. Commercial businesses, big office-based businesses, service industries need a really robust environmental and social governance report. Don't have these standalone on the side necessarily, but make them part of your annual reporting process. Again, make it part of your business strategy going forward. We've heard a lot about science-based reduction strategies and targets today. So go hell for leather and get your science-based target set up as a formal commitment. And again, you may already have something like ISO 14001, and it's a requirement that you need to stand at the leading edge of your sector. Or it may not be something that your stakeholders and client customers are looking for. So a simple environmental management system will suffice, and that should embrace energy and carbon accounting. Getting third-party validation is really important, current carbon assurance, and engaging your supply chain, just going back to the current pandemic and the disruption that's causing to a lot of global supply chains, and making businesses think differently about how they do business and where they source things from. The World Economic Forum is a really good source of information. And if you look at the right-hand side, going from 2007, where economic risks were seen as having a strong likelihood and a big impact, we're now moving ahead to 2020, and you can see that the environment dominates, and that's because environmental risks will come back to be big economic risks for your business. So you really do need to embrace this agenda. To finish up, I'd like to come back to effective data collation and reporting, because this is where a lot of organisations' business plans fall down. The plan is in place, the action plan is in place, but the data collection isn't right. It's what's easy to measure isn't necessarily the thing that you do need to measure. And looking at those quotes there, if you don't have the right data, you are literally blind and deaf and in the middle of a freeway. And if you had a car without wheels, you wouldn't even attempt to drive it. So why on earth try to account for your emissions footprint if you're not collecting the right data, you're not analysing it, and you're not acting on it? So my final advice to everybody is make it happen and get help if you need it. Back to George.
Thank you, Carol. So some questions that have been raised, but before we do that, let's just quickly summarise some of the key points, of which there were many. In Carol's first presentation, we were talking about some key issues there, and she emphasised the importance of the 5 accounting principles. She also talked about the need to consider all scopes, particularly scopes, all scopes 1, 2 and 3. And as Gavin put it, look beyond your own 4 walls, because that's often where your greatest impacts are in terms of GHG emissions. And then Owen gave us a very informative presentation on Gold Standard, explained their background, and really was quite passionate and emphasised the need to follow science-based targets to help all organisations create a pathway to keep us below 1.5 degree Celsius warming before 2030. And it's actually critical that we do that. And it's not good enough, I think one of the other points that Owen was making, to rely on offsetting alone. By all means, use offsetting whilst you're developing your science-based targets and your plan to achieve net zero for your own organisation. But as a long-term strategy, it's not the way to go. Please forgive me if I've overstated that, but that's certainly the message I got there. And then Gavin gave us again another informative presentation and talked about it from a consumer or a stakeholder perspective, and that there has been a shift in the mindset particularly in the UK from the surveys, and the US from what Gavin shared with us, with regards to the belief in the UK's commitment to a net zero target of 2050. He talked about some of the consumer choices that can be made and should be made, and also the ability, particularly of retailers, around choice editing, as you call it, and the importance of consumer engagement and the complexities around that. But he also warned against greenwashing, and I think we've all can cite examples of greenwashing and how it discredits the whole sustainability agenda and obviously our ability to get towards net zero. So if your organisation's engaging in that, or you suspect they are, then I'd suggest you take immediate actions to make it real. And he also stressed the importance of mapping the value chain, going beyond your own four walls, and the importance of addressing the hotspots. And he touched upon the impacts that COVID-19 has had in terms of organisations reevaluating their own way of working, touched upon the impacts of home working, for instance, and reshoring or onshoring, call it what you may. We then obviously just heard from Carol, and some of the key points there. She reiterated and re-emphasised the importance of the 5 accountability principles, and stressed the importance of senior team engagement, particularly around at a board level. You really do need a director or directors on board to make this happen. It's about strategy and sometimes organisation. Well, it is about organisation, business model change, etc. Really is important to ensure that they're GHG literate, and to adopt the plan, do, report, review process that lots of you will be familiar with if you have ISO 50001 or 14001, etc. And you know, I think one of the key points for me is, you know, becoming more sustainable, achieving your net zero target doesn't necessarily cost you money. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. It's something that we've encountered in energy and energy management for many, many years, where there's a belief, well, I have to spend lots of money putting in new black boxes, and we just can't afford it. And besides, we need to focus on our core business. I think the key message here is that if you continue just to focus on your core business activity, whatever that may be, and you completely ignore the climate crisis, as Mark Carney so bluntly put it, you will not have a business in the coming years. It's really critical at every level, from us as individual consumers all the way through to organisations, irrespective of what your organisation is, what sector you're in, that we really need to focus on this. This is the number one issue. COVID, whilst is tragic and appalling, it is a distraction from the biggest threat to mankind, in my view, and that is climate change. And we all have a responsibility to do something about it. So I'll get on my soapbox for a moment, and we'll turn to a number of questions that we received. As I said at the beginning, we will endeavour to address and answer every question that's been submitted. So please, if I don't address your question now, then please bear with us. We will get back to you individually. One of the first questions that came in was, what are each of us doing to reduce our own impacts? I'll start with myself before I invite my fellow panelists to answer on their own behalf. A couple of years ago, I took the decision to, I used to buy 2 suits a year when people used to wear suits. I don't buy suits anymore. And I've noticed that people like Moss Bros, for instance, are now making suits, ties and shirts from, I think it's 40-something% recycled material. So it's a step in the right direction. In terms of travel, I've reduced my business mileage by 50% over the last 2 years. And as an organisation, we've also become ISO 50001 certified, and our biggest impacts is around travel. So we've really focused on that. I either use Zoom or Team, as we all have in the last couple of months, extensively. to negate the need to travel in the first instance. And if I do travel, I try to take public transport whenever that's practical. It's not always practical, but when I can, I do. And even in terms of personal choices, I will only undertake a single return flight a year, because that's one of the biggest impacts from a transport perspective. And in terms of food, I'll never become a vegan, purely personal choice and taste, if you like. However, I've reduced red meat intake, and what red meat I do purchase on the rare occasions, it is locally sourced British products that is free grazing. Carol, do you want to say something about your own personal choices?
Yeah, I try to buy better as much as I can, and that's clothing, cosmetics, shoes. We've had a real soul searching within the family about our diet, so we make sure that we are eating 2 or 3 meals a week that are vegetarian. So we've reduced our meat intake, but we also buy local meat from local producers who have a good, more sustainable production setup. So we're really careful about what we buy. Don't fly very often. If I have to fly, I will offset the flight, and as far as possible, all of my business travel is done by public transport, which has been until now. But yeah, obviously a lot of remote working too.
Gavin, anything to add?
Yes, okay. Well, I've been a vegetarian for over 20 years, and I eat dairy-free as much as I can. The rest of the household doesn't necessarily share my eating preferences, but amongst them there is less and better, I suppose, rather similar to what Carol has just described. I've driven an electric hybrid for the last few years, although I have to say they're not necessarily as good as you might like to believe. We have a green tariff electricity for the home. Like George, I use public transport wherever it's practical, and in fact, where I can, I walk. But with a national scale job, that's obviously very difficult sometimes. Interestingly, just as an aside, University of Leeds published some work last month, top 10 tips effectively for domestic change. So don't drive. If you must drive, use a battery-powered electric vehicle. Don't fly if you can avoid it. Use renewable electricity where you can. Use public transport where you can. Refurbish and renovate your home rather than this is on a societal scale, effectively new builds. Eat vegan are the top 7 of those. So there's some handy tips from that piece of research, which has got some numbers behind it. To Owen's earlier point about not just making stuff up.
Thank you, Owen.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just echo what was just said. To be honest, I think you've got to, well, certainly in my position, walk the talk, right? So the talk is, as I said, get your own backyard in order. So get your own lifestyle in line with the science of climate change. A good way to do that is the WWF tool. That throws up some uncomfortable numbers. I should have said that in the slides. The theory of change, of getting in line with science, is going to make us all look long and hard and take tough decisions. But and that's at business level or personal level. But unfortunately, the science is what it is, and doesn't really care what we like or don't like. You just got to change stuff and get in line with it. So what you do have is some flexibility on the things that you might want to change and the stuff that you can live with. But what you don't have the luxury of is not being in line with science. So personally, I work from home. I've also been a vegetarian for a long time. I don't really drive. My biggest area of concern is work-based flights. Inevitably, in what I do, there's a lot of climate negotiations, and that's morally difficult. To be honest, we're having difficult conversations about that internally. But on a personal level, yeah, I am in line with the science of climate change.
Good. So we've just got a couple of minutes to answer another 1 or 2 questions. One of the first ones was, what are the costs of developing a net zero strategy, and how long will it take to complete the initial process? It's almost to say how long is a piece of string to some extent, but there is a process that we've developed that's phased and is costed reasonably, I believe, to help people along the journey. But I think it depends on the amount of external help that's required to get you there. There is, as Carol pointed out and Owen re-emphasised, there's lots of help out there. It's not just JRP. There are others who can help you with different parts. So I guess it depends on your own knowledge and capability, time and resources, of course. But you know, we're there to help you. We do have an established process. Carol shared with you an example there where we work with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So yes, there's an established process we can help you through, and it's not cost prohibitive, that's for sure. But at the end of the day, it'll get you to where you need to get to. And I think that's the most important thing, as Owen very well phrased earlier on. Anyone got anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, I'll take it.
Very comprehensive, George.
Okay. The next question, this will probably be our last one because I'm just conscious of the time that it's our time is almost up. And that is a question, I think, for Carol. Although UK based, we have offices in other countries. So where should we start? So Carol, if you want to take that one, and if Gavin or Owen have anything to add, then please do so.
Well, this is really dependent on the organisation and where possibly the location of its greatest source of emissions in terms of operational activities, or it could be the centre of decision making, where things are going to be done top down and get a good plan together, or it could be the location where the personnel there are the best placed and most experienced to start putting the action plan together and taking steps, so that you don't have to do it all at once everywhere. You start where you're going to have the biggest impact and then roll it out across the rest of the organisation.
Okay, Gavin, Aaron?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, picking up on the definition of the biggest impact there, it's a combination of the size of the prize and your ability to influence that impact. So don't necessarily chase big numbers if you can't move them. You're better off chasing medium numbers that you can move. And there are one or two questions from the audience that relate to the sort of the systemic nature of the challenge that nod to that as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. It just remains me to thank my fellow panelists for their very valuable and informative input. And thank you everyone for listening in. I hope it's been a valuable experience for you. Thank you for your time. We will be answering all the individual questions to the individual questioners, and we will be sending out a copy of all the slides. But please, if you have anything else, any other requirements, then don't hesitate to contact us as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your attention.